We are delighted that the Woodwards can join us today to share their story, their insights, and their breathtaking photographs. So please join me. Let's welcome Kathy and Carl Woodward.
Thank you, Paul, for that introduction, and thank you for the explanation of how we jumped in here. Just a word of explanation. In 2010, Great Swamp celebrated its 50th anniversary, as did Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Fish and Wildlife Service did a wonderful program, a videotape about Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. We showed that at Great Swamp, and we were a little miffed that they did it about Arctic and not Great Swamp, but we got over that. In getting over it, one of our then board members, Laura Nally, said that she thought we, her husband, and Carl and I should go to visit Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Now, you have to understand that Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, and I'll say ANWR from here on some of the time, has no facilities there. Their headquarters is in Fairbanks, and in a moment you'll see the distance from Fairbanks to actual Arctic. And so to go to Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, you need to find an outfitter to take you there, to go with you there. And so we decided to explore this to see if we could conceivably do this. So George, I'm going to ask you to mute, or Tom, if you could mute George. Thank you. That'll stop the feedback. Thank you. I got the assignment of looking for outfitters, and the refuge has approved outfitters. We decided to go with a company called Arctic Wild. They had several trips that you could take, and the one that seemed sort of reasonable to us was a canoe trip, as opposed to a rafting trip or a backpacking trip. So the canoe trip seemed like something we could do, but I wasn't sure that I was up for 10 days of wilderness canoeing. When we called them, I explained to the fellow that we were soft suburbanites, and he did not seem worried. He asked if we had camped. I said, yes, we were good campers. And he said, fine. Well, you'll be fine. So we signed up, and this is one of the first views, but let me show you. Did you want to say anything else?
Just by way of background, Paul mentioned it, but Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is a total of 19 million acres. And you can see from this photograph where Kathy and Laura are pointing, that's it. 19 million acres, it's the size of the state of South Carolina. It's a critical home to migratory and resident wildlife. You'll see that as well. There are no roads and no facilities and no way in except by air or by boat. There is a designated wilderness area in Arctic of over 8 million acres. And one other thing, if you can scroll out a little bit, Kath, right at the bottom is Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge, which is the third largest refuge in the United States. Arctic is the largest, and Yukon Delta is the second largest. But in any event, there is the entire northeast corner of Alaska, all the way up to the Beaufort Sea, is National Wildlife Refuge. And the bottom line is you have to, in order to really go to where we wanted to go, which was the North Slope, you had to fly over the Brooks Range.
Yeah, I'm assuming you can see my cursor here. And this is the Brooks Range.
That is the Brooks Range, which extends basically all the way across the northern half of Alaska, and it has heights up to 9,000 feet. So it's a very substantial barrier. I think we'll talk more later about what the latest issues are with it, but the issue with the North Slope, this is the North Slope area right here. And this area is the area that's been the subject for years, decades, of whether or not to drill for oil. And that's an issue. And you'll see our position, which is, hey, it's a wonderful, one of the last major wilderness areas, not only in the United States, but in the world.
So just so, this is we were on the Canning River. We put in right about here. And then we followed the Canning River down here to the Beaufort Sea. You can see the Canning River is pretty in banks until we get down here where it goes off into a delta and things are very braided. And this was where canoeing got very interesting. But first, so we flew to Fairbanks. Let me show you where Fairbanks is. Where is Fairbanks?
Right here.
Fairbanks is here. We flew to Fairbanks a day and a half early to meet our guides, and we had two guides, a man and a woman, and got our gear. So we got our tents, our sleeping bags, etc. We stayed overnight in a bed and breakfast because we kept our luggage there while we were gone for the 10 days. We then flew from Fairbanks to Arctic Village, which is here, and then got on smaller planes to fly over the Brooks Range to our put-in. So enough of that. We visited the headquarters in Fairbanks. We went to the headquarters before and after. We had to get our passport book stamped afterwards, but before we went, and people there were very excited that we were going. Many of the employees don't get up to Arctic because of the logistics and the expense of getting there. And they were very excited, though, we were going, and wanted to hear all about our trip when we got back.
So the morning that we left, we had one of our guides, Dan Ritzman, with whom we are still friendly. He was a terrific guy. Here's Joe Nally, Laura Nally, Kathy, and this woman in the back was a native nurse who was flying back to Arctic Village. And this is a Caribou, which is a standard large single engine plane that carries up to a dozen people. So this is what we were flying in all the way up to Arctic Village.
This plane flies between Arctic and Fairbanks 2 or 3 times a week. And so that is their connection.
And here we are at Arctic Village. The runway is gravel, dirt. That's the visitor center, if you will. People hanging out there. We've got a local puppy. And
you can see the outhouse behind. After we left out, that was the last of the facilities we saw for the next 10 days.
That's the last outhouse we saw. And this is another map that shows exactly where we were. So here's Arctic Village, which, by the way, is right on the Arctic Circle. And when you go north of it, and at the time of year that we were there, the sun never sets. And when we left Arctic Village, we got on smaller planes. These were called Helios. They are like Piper Cubs. They would hold a maximum of 4 people, plus all of that luggage. We were limited to 50 pounds each, plus the other equipment, and in this particular case, the canoes themselves, which were collapsible, and you'll see how that goes. And here we are. This is below the Brooks Range as we're approaching it. There are lots of rivers and lakes up in this area, and this is our trip. We're sort of headed to that white spot up in the very top of the picture. The maximum altitude that these planes can fly is about 6,000 or 7,000 feet. So we were just right at just barely able to get over the mountains.
So you can see the scenery was incredible. Of course, we're getting more excited and, for me, a little more scared as we start seeing this kind of landscape.
And this is a shot of the crest of the Brooks Range. You can see we actually saw a bear hiking around on here, but I didn't get it in the picture, but it's massive. It's really impressive. Now it's July, so most of the snow is melted.
But you can see snow in the crevices.
Yep.
These are giant ice fields that remain, and you'll see later some of them remain all year round on the rivers. We are starting to lose elevation because we are about to land on a gravel bar in the Canning River. And we're coming down. Here is where we will be landing. And here, I'm going to bring you in a little bit, there were 3 planes that went up. Here you can see the first of our planes that's landed. Our second guide, Cindy, had arrived the day before, and she had set up camp down here already. So we spent that evening on this gravel bar. And there you can see one of the planes is already down. Here we are coming in. Here's the plane after us landing. And there we are. Go ahead.
Now you can see 2 things. A, it's just gravel. B, the plane has on it what are called tundra tires. They are big balloon tires that enable these planes to land almost anywhere that it's relatively flat. And these pilots, these bush pilots, are incredible. They fly in and fly out of all different kinds of situations. And here is one that's just taking off or landing. This one, now it's taking off.
When these planes left, we realized that we had no communication for the next 10 days. That's not quite true. The guides had a satellite phone, and we found out they did check in twice with the outfitter during the week, but we unpacked and we were on our own for the next week. Let us introduce you to our bathroom facilities. So here we have, water would be taken out of the river, later out of some ponds. The bucket on the left and it had a foot pedal over here, was pumped to wash your hands, and that was unfiltered water. On the right was a bucket with filtered water, you can see, and that was what we drank and cooked with the rest of the week. Over on the right is, as I mentioned, there were no facilities, and that meant no restrooms. So for our restrooms, we would go out, we would dig a hole. Assuming we peed. But other than that, we had to dig a hole. And then in the bag that's there is bear spray, which we carried with us all the time, in addition to the bags. Also toilet paper and matches. So in the case that we used toilet paper, we would have to burn the toilet paper before we recovered the hole. If anybody out there is going, ooh, you got used to it. Initially, there were willow bushes around so that when you went to the use of the facilities, you had some place to go behind. But as we made our way north to the Bering Sea, the willows got shorter and shorter and shorter. We learned how to respect each other's privacy, and it was fine. If you have any questions, write them down, or if you want to, you can unmute too and ask.
This is our tent, and we have our equipment that we didn't put in the tent outside it, which is where we left it. Kathy mentioned the willows. You can see the willows are at this point, head high, 6 feet, 7 feet. But as we got farther out, they got shorter and shorter till you got to the Beaufort Sea, and the height of the willows was about 6 inches. Now, here's our canoes. These were incredibly seaworthy. They were rubberized canvas, and they assembled like an erector set. Here's Dan and Sen putting the parts inside the little channels to assemble the canoe. And by the way, we didn't mention, but there were 6 of us actually on the trip, including in addition to the 2 guides. We had the Nallies and us, that was 4, and then we had another couple from Seattle, Washington, whom we did not know, but were very nice, except they were complete vegetarians.
Well, we'll come back to that.
And that was
why
that led to some humor.
Yes, it did. And also you might notice Sin is in sandals. The weather at this point was temperate
In the 60s.
in the 60s, because we were still near the Brooks Range, and remember, the sun never set. And this is what the
assembled canoe looks like.
And there was a seat, a middle seat, and here are the ever-present binoculars in the middle as well.
And what you have to understand is, in the canoe, all lashed in, whenever we were on the canoe and on the river, was our personal gear and our share of the collective gear. So the canoes were well loaded, but these canoes were really, really seaworthy.
So the first afternoon we spent getting acclimated. We did a little hiking around. Our first looks at Arctic on the ground. We'll talk more about this plant that's growing here, the bear grass. Our campsite is down here by the river, so we're getting a look at where we're going to go. I love this picture because Dan and Carl are sitting looking downriver to where our adventure will begin.
Looking north. Everything was north.
After dinner, we went for another hike. The light changed significantly as the sun fell lower in the sky. The silence was incredible, except for birdsong. We'll come back to that.
One of the things that our guides wanted us to do was to stay up late. Of course, we were always tired, especially with canoeing all day long and pulling canoes around and that sort of thing. But we would stay up as late as 10 or 11, but the sun never set. So there was always light, and we would go to sleep when we got tired. But the color of the light changed dramatically, and it was really very spectacular.
This is the next morning. We're looking up to where we've flown over and looking forward. So here we're starting to pack up that first morning. You can see all of the things that we have to get in the 4 canoes. And the first morning was an interesting one. I love this picture because it sort of was how I felt that day, of being excited, but these massive mountains and this river were incredibly beautiful.
And overwhelming.
This picture is actually in time frame a little, we wanted to show the span of the day, but this was taken a little further on our trip. We know this because we have more clothes on. But mid-morning we would stop and have a very wonderful snack. We were expending a lot of energy, and so they kept us well fed. And so at our snack mid-morning, we could have as much chocolate as we wanted, as much peanut butter, as much high protein things, but to keep our energy up and our spirits up. And it worked.
And then we had lunch.
And we knew this was lunch because they set up the table.
And they would get out all different kinds of foods, usually just to make sandwiches and cheeses and salami. And it was interesting. We were probably eating I don't know, several thousand calorie per day diet. And it was to keep us going. And we were burning up a lot of energy. And some days it was cloudy, some days it was sunny. We avoided a lot of rain. We had rain around us, and we had one day where we had, or one night where we had a significant rainstorm. But other than that, the weather was remarkably good.
And we saw no one else the whole trip until we got right down to the Beaufort Sea. We saw several times we saw airplanes go over at very high altitude, but that was it. This is the cook tent. We helped with most of what went on. We loaded the canoes, we unloaded it. We were responsible for setting up our own tents. But Sin insisted on cooking. She was a good cook. The meals were delicious. They were high in fiber because they didn't want anyone having issues with using the facilities. And we were there for 4th of July, and we had canned turkey, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, and some kind of brownies for dessert. So decent.
You should know a little bit about our 2 guides. Sin lived near Denali, and her husband was a fireman, I believe.
Yeah.
She had worked as a plumber. She went to Virginia Tech. She graduated, but she decided she wanted more adventure. So she ended up going to Antarctica, where she worked as a plumber's assistant for a year. And then she came back and settled in Alaska. And it was carpentry. She was a carpenter's assistant. Besides helping to build homes and that sort of things in Alaska, she does this guiding, and she was really incredibly strong and incredibly agile and very, very smart about the way things went. She used a Coleman stove to cook, and she was really good. Now, Dan Rissman was the director of the Sierra Club in Seattle, Washington. He had been previously, as a member of Greenpeace, involved in Alaska, particularly protesting against development of the Prudhoe oil field, and actually spent a winter out on the ice with some other Greenpeace people as part of their protest. Interesting guy, fascinating people who really knew what they were doing out in the wilderness.
So here's Cindy cooking. This is dinner, so you can see we always have bottles of hot water, and we had a table. Everybody noticed the Sibley field guide in the foreground. Because of our age, they included these little stools in our gear. So we did appreciate those. And they also included a scope, partly because I think Carl's interested in birding, so we'll get to that.
One thing that you need to notice is Kathy has on the mosquito
Well, there's more. You'll see
facility, the mosquito clothing, and she'll explain that. Actually, I have mine on too.
So this is why we have the mosquito netting on. This was the inside of our tent. Mosquitoes were fierce. I should say this was taken from inside of our tent. 90% of those mosquitoes are on the outside, but some of them were on the inside. And every night when you went in, you figured a couple minutes to get rid of all the mosquitoes inside. And so you'd get a good night's sleep. And we did sleep well.
And you
Again,
always try to face downwind, because if you faced into the wind, you had mosquitoes all over your face. So here we are sideways or back to the, but you can see all the mosquitoes. This was the season for mosquitoes. We didn't have problems with biting flies and black flies, that sort of thing, but we did have issues with mosquitoes. Although interestingly enough, they only bit between certain temperatures. I forget exactly what they were. So if the temperature dropped too low or got too high, they didn't bother you. They just were there.
And only the females bite. So here Laura and I are modeling our bug shirts. So you can see that in addition to the pouches in the front, the netting on the side, there's nettings that go over your face. And we use those at times. And you can see our facilities in the background. This is a typical campsite.
Now you can see there's a rainstorm coming up, but it blew right past us. It did not blow over us. And because the view shed was so large, you could see a storm, but you had no idea whether it was going to come over you or not. In this particular case, it was raining, as you can see, but it
didn't rain on us.
Didn't rain on us. Again, here's another rainstorm, quite substantial. There was even lightning with that one, but it again, it crossed on the other side of the river, and we were safe. And you can see, by the way, the willows are shorter. They're not over the top of the tent. They're about 3 feet. And they give you still a certain degree of privacy, but that's an issue. And this is how we tied up our canoes at night so they wouldn't drift away. This is a floodplain, and you could have a major melt or a major storm upstream, and the river could rise 4 or 5 inches or 6 or 7 inches. So if you didn't have your canoes tied up really well, you might find yourself walking a long way.
A long way. Additionally, Dan, after we settled in for the afternoon, evening, he would set up a stone cairn down by the edge of the river. And then the next morning, he would know whether the river had come up or fallen. That would give him an indication of whether we were going to have flow with us that day to help us canoe, or whether we were going to be paddling. It was incredible.
We're looking back at the Brooks Range.
Yes.
Yeah.
You can see our camp over here, and if you look carefully, you can see our canoes tied up at the bottom of the bluff.
I mean, we're looking south to the Brooks Range, and you can see how high they are, and this big bend in the river. And this scene is kind of reminiscent of things that you saw in the West during the 1850s and 40s, when explorers were out in that area of the western United States.
The bird life was incredible. I'll let Carl take over.
So this is along the river. One of the disadvantages with birding on the river is that the river is below the surrounding floodplain, so you don't see necessarily all the bird life, but occasionally there were rock outcroppings, as there were here. And this is a gerfalcon on the left, an adult gerfalcon, and it's young on the right hand side. They obviously have typically build the nests the way raptors do, and there's a lot of guano there, but they're beautiful birds. And this is a rough-legged hawk perched on top of this rocky outcrop. These birds were all together. He didn't like us too much, nor did and he was flying over us, but I thought that you'd appreciate the magnificence of the rough-legged hawk, which we don't see around here very often. And then we came upon a peregrine nest. Here's again, this peregrine's not happy with us, and he was flying over us, calling and calling and calling,
and trying to stare us down.
Yeah, trying to give us the evil eye. And then at other places, there were meadows, obviously, everywhere. And this is the rock ptarmigan. You can't see it, but this ptarmigan has little guys running around right behind. And and what's that, bear grass?
Yes.
Or cotton grass?
Cotton grass. Sorry.
Cotton grass. And they eat that stuff. There's a lot of stuff to eat.
Yeah.
A lot of stuff to eat. This is another shot of the ptarmigan. And here we have pectoral sandpiper with its young, obviously along the bank of the river. And at nighttime, things kind of quieted down, except for the Lapland longspur, which is what this is, and it would call all night long.
Sang all night long. It was wonderful. You'd wait, you'd sort of rouse, and
just beautiful bird. And here we have an American golden plover. I always thought it was a Pacific golden plover until I got home, and then I looked it up in the book and compared it to the American golden plover and realized, it's really the American golden plover, which has a little larger range than the Pacific, and its markings, while very similar, are somewhat different. And what's behind? What do you have there?
So you have buttercups, you have the red dock, you have I'm not sure. We'll identify some of the others in a bit. But this would be a typical scene on some of your southern facing slopes along the river. The growing season is incredibly short, but incredibly intense. We saw spiders, we saw butterflies, we saw bees. How can that be when they only have 4 or 5 months growing season? But they were there.
This is a long-tailed jager, which is a predatory seabird. It will feed on lemmings. It will feed on fish. It will feed on a variety of things. Beautiful bird. We don't usually see them here in New Jersey. And this is a red-necked phalarope, which we saw in one of the many ponds that we would hike up to see. And they're typical phalarope stuff. We get them around here occasionally. But it was nice to see them. And here, this picture is taken out near the Beaufort Sea. You can see the delta actually at the very top of the picture. Over that last rise is the Beaufort Sea. But these are common eiders, all females, flying in formation. And here's a ground squirrel.
They were all over the place.
Everywhere. Now, one time, as we were about 2/3 of the way down to the Beaufort Sea. We had pitched camp here, and you can see we have our tent set up some distance apart. And you can also see the willows are getting shorter. In any event, we broke camp and we were just getting ready to launch when out of the willows by the river comes a wolf. And he trotted past us and stopped and just looked at us. Now, this wolf is less than 50 feet away, really close. Watched us for 5 to 10 minutes, and we just, we were entranced by its proximity. It probably never seen a human being before. Nothing aggressive, just curious. Hey, who are these folks? And then it trotted off. But it's a magnificent spot. Now, we didn't see any bear. Disappointment in a way, but that is a fresh bear print. It probably had been made not more than an hour or two before we came by. And grizzlies were the bears that you would have seen. Although, interestingly enough, we were told that they were not as big as the grizzlies down along the Kenai Peninsula and so on, because the Canning River does not have any salmon in it. It's only got Dolly Varden trout and one other type of fish.
But no salmon.
But no salmon.
It's interesting. We were looking at these slides yesterday. Sorry. Oops, sorry. And I don't know what made me focus. Was this the one?
Yeah, that's it. It's right in the middle.
Someplace in here, there's a ptarmigan.
Right here.
Oh, yeah. And we hadn't realized that until yesterday, or maybe we knew it then, but
Here, use your cursor.
it's okay.
Okay.
Again, we're progressing down the.
Now, as we got down the river, things started getting more braided. And for canoers, when it gets braided, you have to pick the right channel because the water is very shallow. And in some cases, our two guides actually, when we got in the lower part of the river, hadn't actually canoed that area before. Now, there were no major rapids, so it was that's why we were canoeing rather than rafting. But Sin was really, really good at picking the best channel. Occasionally, we had to do a little dragging the canoes in 2 inches of water, but most of the time, she'd get us so we wouldn't have to get out. And we did see a moose. We saw several moose. We actually saw 2 other wolves, but they were a good distance away. But the one that came in close.
So the canoeing was a little more difficult. We had one day off the river, and this was the day we went hiking, a little more extensive hiking. So we had our lunch up on one of the bluffs. And we got treated to a rainbow that day. The fellow from Seattle sang in a men's barbershop quartet. And so we would often sing when 4th of July, we did a whole patriotic repertoire. And this day, we were inspired to sing a whole lot of rainbow songs, as you can imagine. And the guides said it was the first in their guiding. They had never had a musical quartet along before. As you can see, it's getting flatter. That means that there's less flow in the river, and that means you paddle harder.
And as we got farther out to the river, out to the Beaufort Sea, the wind came up. The wind was coming from the north. It was blowing right into our faces. And so some days were really, really hard.
This is our, you saw some pictures of it from afar. This is something called German word Auf ice. And it's remains of during the winter, obviously the river freezes. And the spring thaw, the center thaws out, but the edges remain frozen. So here we are in July in Alaska, standing on an ice shelf. We actually broke off some ice, and that night had ice in our Kool-Aid. This is the valley to the left. Then the background is where we came from.
Now, one other thing, if you go back a second, you can see by the length of the shadows. Now, this is in the middle of the day. The sun never gets very high in the sky, period. And you can witness that given the
Time of day.
the latitude, and it's quite remarkable. And so the sun was, if you were in the wrong direction, the sun was always right in your face. This is looking back to where we'd come. That's what we came through, that valley that's there. We canoed down through that whole area.
This, as Carl said, is cotton grass. It's one of the prime, it has a lot of protein in it, and it is one of the reasons for the caribou herds being there. We were eager to see the caribou. It's part of the reason we went. And this is another, oh, sorry, I got ahead of my story. Here are some of the plants that we saw. They are all in miniature. These are forget-me-nots. It's the state flower of Alaska. They were even smaller than our forget-me-nots here. Eskimo potato. The roots are edible and eaten by anything that can dig, and including the native peoples. Arctic dock. We have a dock, but this was a much, the red on this was much more stunning. You can see every picture was easy to take. The purple flowers, lupin. Tiny little wintergreen.
And we are talking something a matter of a few inches high.
Right.
Alaska poppies. And this one's taken actually out by the Beaufort Sea. You can see how low everything is.
The sandbanks.
And the sandbanks.
Cotton grass.
More cotton grass.
So we were looking for caribou. And here we saw one of our first caribou over here on the right. Dan and our guide and Carl went out. He thought that pretending we were caribou might draw him in. And it did. But then he said, nah, I don't think so. But he checked back with us. And they're walking away. Everybody's laughing. But we did see caribou. The caribou came in waves. You want to talk about porcupine?
The porcupine caribou herd, which is what we saw, or parts of it, is about 200,000 strong. It spends its winters down in the Yukon and migrates 500 miles up to this very spot, the north slope of Arctic Refuge, to drop their calves, to fatten up on the rich vegetation, in fact, even going offshore onto the ice to get away from the various insects that bother them. There is not only the mosquitoes, but there's some, the bot flies are really, really nasty and quite damaging. And you can see they're curious. They know we're here. And we probably saw several thousand.
They'd come in waves, and we'll tell you about that in a second. But
this is a video that we took.
You can see the young in among them. And a group would go on for 10, 15 minutes, then there'd be a break. And then we'd see another group go through.
And
we're almost to the end of our journey.
This is the delta. at the mouth of the river before it enters the Beaufort Sea. And that white line in the upper part of the picture is the ice that's on the Beaufort Sea. There's water in front of it, but there's ice flows behind. Here we have some shots of a cow, caribou with her calf. The couple from Seattle is standing on their other side. They took this picture of us looking at the same thing.
So we were very worried because we knew this calf would be very susceptible to wolves, but the next group of caribou that came through picked it up and they went on with that group. So it was interesting. Our last night was an interesting one. We're actually going over to this bar on the right to be picked up for the next day for our trip home. But the wind was strong into us,
and we had white caps.
And we had white caps out here. So they said, hey, the winds will drop. Just go take a nap, go rest. We finally crossed at 11 o'clock that night when they finally
the wind dropped a bit, as they said, and we canoed through. It was a bit harrowing, but in any event, while we were waiting, back up one.
Okay.
We walked to this edge. We're looking out across the delta to the Beaufort Sea. And here we are waiting for our plane. This is the group.
When we were stuck over there on the other side, we saw these two tents over there. We found out that they were a quote bird camp from Fish and Wildlife Service. They had the people, they flashed their mirrors to let us know that they knew we were there. When we finally made it across, now it's 11 o'clock at night, they came down and brought us some cookies. They were in their last week of being there to do research, but we met one of their friends. So the final day before we got on the plane to fly back to Arctic Village and then Fairbanks, I decided I better use the facilities. So I went out, but as I went out, an Arctic fox came to visit me. He no doubt had been fed goodies from the people that were up in the bird camp, because he came and he sat and he talked to me. He looked at me for a while looking for a handout, which I didn't have. But everybody else got a good look at this Arctic fox. This was our Christmas card picture. This was our...
was a Beaver, which was a 1950s all-metal single-engine aircraft. An amazing... They don't make them anymore, but they were specifically designed to be bush planes. They had the Tundra tires, and it was a very, very sturdy plane. You felt very safe inside.
You can take off and land in very small areas. Once we took off, you can see here, this is one of the herds of caribou that we crossed over. They now are headed back to Canada and the Yukon, where they'll spend the winter. Just a couple closing shots. Over here is shooting stars, the purple flower, the lupin we talked about. The flowers were incredible. Some of our view sheds, more flowers, sorry. Our canoes. Our campsites. And we had some time alone at times. The upper left, the biggest picture is Carl fishing. He did not catch anything. The waters were silty, but the couple that were with us that were vegan were not happy that he was fishing, and he thought that impacted his fishing, but who knows? So